Hello, and welcome to Panned Dead Center. My name is Kevin, and today I thought we'd talk a little bit about contrast and variation in music, and how we, as music makers, can use these tools.
Handstand Center.
Contrast and variation is an interesting topic in both composing and production, and one I don't feel we talk about enough. Can you have too much contrast in a piece of music? Yes. If you've ever tried to put two unfinished songs together, you know that it usually doesn't work, though you might occasionally get lucky. But can you have too little contrast? Also yes. And this, I feel, is the more common situation. Stravinsky drew a distinction between contrast, which you want, and variety, which you don't. Now, just to be clear, we're talking about two different topics here, and it's important that we keep them separate. Contrast is when a song moves into a section that sounds different than the previous one, though they still somehow fit together. A verse and a chorus usually contrast with each other, but if they're well written, they work. Variation, on the other hand, is what distinguishes one chorus from another on the same record. If someone took a song you wrote, recorded, and produced, and dropped the proverbial needle at a certain point in the middle, would you be able to tell if you were listening to the second iteration of the chorus or the third? Or could someone else who's heard the song, let's say, 5 times, could they tell which chorus it is? If the choruses sound too similar, then I'd say there's a fundamental problem. You don't want your listener to say, "Oh, hey, they just copied and pasted the chorus together." Let's begin by looking at some extreme examples of contrast in popular music. And I don't think you can find a better example than Bohemian Rhapsody. This song is a fine example of what's called through composed, meaning that no section of the music ever repeats. Once the section is finished, it never comes back. And when the song ends, you're still hearing new material. Now, just to be clear, through composed does not mean sections cannot be repeated. To use another example by Queen, the song March of the Black Queen from their second album does have a sort of chorus that comes back a few times, always varied, but there is always new material coming in. But have you ever asked yourself why Bohemian Rhapsody works when, by all rights, it really should sound like a bunch of different songs jammed together? Of course, there are some motifs that recur throughout the song. These help considerably to glue the song together, but I don't think they can be credited with all of the success. I'm not going to answer the question of why the whole thing works, but I would like to point out one thing. After the rock section and the trumpet-like fanfares in the transition, when we arrive at the slow ending section, the part with "nothing really matters, anyone can see," it feels somewhat like we have returned to music that we have heard earlier, and yet we haven't. Except for the piano motif at the very end before the tam-tam strike, this is entirely new music. Yet it feels like we have returned to an earlier section. This reminds me of something that my professor, Bill Russo, used to say. It's more important to return to the texture of an earlier section than to return to its material. I'm sure there must be a few other examples from the world of pop music that do this, probably in prog rock, but the only other example I can produce right now is Stairway to Heaven. When Led Zeppelin pulls the rein and the hard rock section gives way to that very brief and suddenly very quiet coda. When Robert Plant slowly intones, and she's buying a stairway to heaven, it isn't a melody that we've heard earlier in the song. Yet it nonetheless feels like we have come back to where we started, just perhaps a little wiser from the journey. Journey is a metaphor we will come back to a few times in this talk. Another example of a well-known song that makes use of extreme contrast is the Beatles' A Day in the Life. Now this is famously two different songs, one written by Lennon and another by McCartney, that really were jammed together. But again, they work. This time, though, they work not just because of the songwriting, but because of the production. And technically, it's both. George Martin bridges the introduction of that second song with that wonderful orchestral glissando, and then drops us squarely and suddenly into a new world crafted by McCartney. Songwriting, on the other hand, transitions us back to the return of the earlier material sung by Lennon. And since we're talking about contrast, it's worth pointing out one contrast that's hiding in plain sight in this song. The lyrics are mundane, intentionally so. I don't mean that they're bad. They just depict daily life, Lennon having taken his from the UK Daily Express. Musically, however, it is anything but mundane. It is an important piece of the puzzle in the revolution that pop music experienced in the 1960s. But these are, as I've said, extreme examples. There is much to be learned from them, and if you want more examples, the first 5 albums by Queen have at least one song that is a bona fide example of through composition. I think every songwriter should challenge themselves to write a song along the lines of Bohemian Rhapsody, if only for the practice. You needn't include an opera section, but try writing a piece with multiple sections that contrast in tempo, in meter, and in texture. It's a challenge that will reward. But let us now turn to instances that are more moderate in their use of contrast, and yet, perhaps, almost as remarkable and effective. In the world of popular music, there are at least 4 areas in which contrast can be applied. In the lyrics, in the songwriting, as in the melody, in the performance, and in production. I will talk about the first 3 of these, omitting production. The reason for this is that I feel that production too frequently carries the entire burden of variation. The song is seen as a collection of verses matched with a chorus, and production is seen as the means to keep these unchanging entities interesting, often by adding more instruments, more voices, more volume. The point of this talk is to show otherwise, to demonstrate that verses and choruses do not have to be fixed entities, and that some of the great songs in the pop world do not adhere strictly to how we expect verses and choruses to behave. The music of Simon and Garfunkel is rich with examples of these. So let's first discuss what a typical pop song looks like in order to better see how Paul Simon frequently violates our expectations. Your typical pop song generally begins with an introduction. Then you get a verse. Then you get a chorus. And then you get another verse. And the chorus repeats. Many songs, though by no means all, will often go into a middle 8. Some people call that a bridge, but some people use the word bridge to refer to what other people call the pre-chorus. Let's call it a middle 8 since, although it's not always accurate, as it doesn't always have 8 bars, it is at least clear. At this point, we may go back to the verse, or maybe more frequently, we skip it and go into another chorus. In fact, you will find that in many songs, once you're about halfway through, you never hear the verse again. And often if you do, it's the music of the verse over which you may get a guitar solo rather than an actual sung verse. And after this, it's usually repeating the chorus until the song fades away or gets a proper ending. Now, obviously, not every song is structured this way, but I think what I've described qualifies as a typical example. Let's focus just on the verse and chorus today. An interesting question to ask ourselves is, how are verses and choruses different from each other? That is, how do we know that this is the verse and this the chorus? Is it just because the verse comes first? Clearly not, because there's a large handful of songs that begin with the chorus. Think Journey's Any Way You Want It or the Beatles' Help, among numerous other examples. To rephrase the question, how do we know that those are choruses and not verses? Is it because there are more voices singing the chorus? After all, isn't that what the word chorus means, as in like the Chicago Symphony chorus? But again, no, though it is often the case. Obviously, I could write a song and sing it entirely solo and still have a section that is clearly the chorus. And in the songs of Simon and Garfunkel, it's often both of them singing the verse as well as the chorus. We may not find a definition that accounts for every single song with a verse and a chorus. Instead, we'll need to look at traits that usually hold true. So here's a simple one. Each time you hear the verse, it's usually the same melody, but with different lyrics. Now, of course, sometimes the final verse may repeat the lyrics of an earlier one, but verses are almost always marked by having different lyrics, while the chorus is, from the perspective of songwriting, stable and unchanging. Think about the music on the printed page. The repeat signs encompass both the verse and the chorus, but the verses have multiple lines of lyrics underneath them, while the chorus section has just one. Now, we could keep discussing the differences, and there are many we haven't gotten to, such as the lyrics of the verses usually being, a bit more conversational, or the music of the chorus usually being in a higher register. But I don't want to get further astray from the topic at hand, which is contrast and examples of how this is used by Simon and Garfunkel. Mrs. Robinson. Now, if you grew up in an English-speaking country, you've heard the song. Even if you weren't around when it came out, and I was only a baby at the time, it still played on the radio. And I remember there being a cover version of it back in the 90s. Now, the actual lyrics are great, as Paul Simon's lyrics usually are. But we're not going to talk about the rhymes or the word choices, great as they are. Simon did two things here, which I find extraordinary, both of which relate to contrast in lyrics. Now, I have a question for you, and if you want to pause me and listen to the song, get it fresh in your head, please do. The question is this: does the song begin with the verse or with the chorus? And that's a question that should be straightforward and not at all ambiguous, and yet you could argue for either possibility. The verse is that melody accompanying the lyrics, "We'd like to know a little bit about you for our files." And the chorus begins with, "And here's to you, Mrs. Robinson." So any difficulty we have with this question does not stem from uncertainty over which one is which. There's a verse, we know it. There's a chorus, we know that's the chorus. But the stance I'm going to take is that it begins with the verse. But it's a very, very unusual verse. It's a verse that doesn't have any lyrics. It's just deet, 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 and doot, 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 until we get to the first chorus, which suddenly has lyrics. The end result, and try to imagine someone who has never heard the song before, is that those nonsense syllables are actually the introduction, and the song begins with the chorus. However, the music that they were singing is the music of the verses, just without any lyrics. Take a moment and think what a bizarre choice that is. At some point when this song was coming together, Simon or Garfunkel or producer Ron Halley said, "Hey, let's sing the first verse without any lyrics." What kind of mental process even leads anybody to conceive that choice? But let's be very clear here. It works. I'm not saying it's strange and bad. No, 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 no. It's strange and magnificent. When the chorus and lyrics do come in, they're just that much more powerful. We've been hearing the singers singing their song for 20 seconds before we get to the lyrics. They could have begun with the real verse, or they could have begun with the chorus. Instead, they play with our expectations. And it's only when we re-listen to it that we realize, oh, that was the verse. But wait, there's more. There are two surprises hiding in all of this. First of all, if you try singing the lyrics of a later verse while they're singing the doot 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 doots, you realize that they don't even sing the last line. The part, most of all, you got to hide it from the kids, that part, not sung. No doot doot doots, nothing. Just the acoustic guitar taking us into that first chorus. And that contributes even more to making this feel like it's an introduction. I don't know if they didn't sing it or if it was cut out in the mixing. I could certainly believe either way. I kind of suspect it was the latter. Either way, brilliant. And the second little surprise. What is the first actual word that we hear? It's and. And here's to you, Mrs. Robinson. Now, this is not the only song that begins with and. It's probably not even the first one, but I'm pretty sure it's the only song that begins with and when they've already been singing halfway through the song's main structure. Now, I said there were two things that I find extraordinary about the lyrics. Everything I've said so far was just the first. If you did pause me and listen to the song, you probably know what I'm going to say because I think this one is a bit more obvious. We hear the chorus of this song 4 times throughout the song. We get to the first one about 30 seconds in. Now, we've already said that choruses don't change lyrics, so I know you see what's coming, right? And when we get to the second chorus, sure enough, it's a literal repeat. But when we get to the third chorus, things start to change. Instead of, and here's to you, Mrs. Robinson, we get, of all things, coo-coo-ca-choo, Mrs. Robinson. Nonsense syllables that perhaps tie back to that first verse. And let's not forget the chorus itself has some whoa, whoa, whoas and hey, hey, heys. Non-lyric lyrics abound in this song. I've never seen or read an interview with Simon about this, but I always thought that with the coo-coo-ca-choo, he was perhaps misquoting the goo-goo-gajoob of I Am the Walrus. That song was merely 2 months old when Mrs. Robinson was completed, and it wasn't the cultural phenomenon that it's become since. Or perhaps he deliberately changed it, or maybe I'm wrong and it's totally unrelated. The point is, we get a variation interrupting an otherwise literal repeat of the chorus. Paul Simon is telling us that, hey, the chorus doesn't have to have the same lyrics throughout. Then, of course, he pulls the rug out from under us with that fourth and final chorus, where we hear not just a phrase being substituted with a new one, but an entirely new set of lyrics. Instead of, and here's to you, Mrs. Robinson, we get, where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio? In the last section of new lyrics, we suddenly, out of nowhere, get a new character. Not even a character really, but a real-life celebrity crashing into the fictional narrative we've been enjoying. The lyrics are completely different, not just a variation where he replaces one name with another. And then, in the second half of this final chorus, Mrs. Robinson comes back, alongside Jolton Joe DiMaggio. It's Father Mackenzie burying Eleanor Rigby all over again. There is so much that songwriters can learn from this one song. Not only do we get minor and then major changes to the lyrics of the chorus, which aren't supposed to change in the first place, but even when verses are expected to change lyrics each time we hear them, we still get a variation in how we expect verses to behave. And not only that, it's a variation before the pattern has even been established. We haven't heard the verses yet, and already we get a major variation of it. And that's what draws you back. That's what brings you back. It's one thing to write a song that people enjoy the first time they hear it. It's quite another to create a song that people want to hear again because they have an awareness that there are still mysteries to unlock. And as songwriters and composers, I think that may be the greatest skill we can develop. When verses and choruses do what verses and choruses are supposed to do, and there's a time and place for that, but we are making it easy for the listener. We're sending a message. You know what to expect. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to think about my song. It establishes a relationship between musician and audience, one that says, here's my song, I promise, no surprises. But when a song plays with our expectations, we're not aware, on first listen anyway, exactly what happened. Nobody listens to Mrs. Robinson the first time and say, oh, that's cool. They're singing the verses only without any lyrics. How could they? They haven't heard an actual verse yet. But I think we are aware, at least vaguely, that something is not jiving with what we expected, and that is what brings us back. Great melody, we want to hear it again. Great lyrics, we want to hear them again too. Great performance, great production. But it's also a song we didn't fully understand. They played with the simple, basic structure of the song in a way that makes us aware we need to hear it again. Again, are we making music for people to enjoy once, or do we make music that draws the listener back? Now, I enjoy a lot of prog rock, but I don't think we need to make 20-minute songs borrowing elements from classical music. Music doesn't have to be difficult to draw the listener back. Mrs. Robinson is not a difficult song, but there is so much more to it when you scratch the surface. So what can you do with your song that throws the listener off a little bit? Not in a Bohemian Rhapsody sort of way, but in a Mrs. Robinson sort of way. You have music that is simple A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B. But married to that music are lyrics that are not A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B. That's a simple brilliance that we can all learn from. So, the first way we can vary our music is the lyrics, assuming we're writing songs and not instrumentals. Let's skip over the music, the melody itself, just for a moment. We will talk about it today. And talk instead about performance. Now, by performance variation, I don't mean that one performance of the song is different than another performance, but rather making minor changes in the melody as the song progresses. Changes that feel like they might have been improvised, even if they weren't. Billy Joel is a textbook example of this. Whenever he sings the final verse of a song, you know it's the final verse of the song because he's putting more energy into it. He's infusing that melody with some higher notes. Or sometimes he does the opposite. After the long journey he takes us on in scenes from an Italian restaurant, we arrive back where we started. A bottle of red, a bottle of white. We hear this section twice, but compare how differently he sings them. It begins fresh. Here's the melody. It's straight. But this is his Bohemian Rhapsody. And when he returns to this material again at the end, he sounds exhausted. And not in a bad way. It very effectively highlights the driving energy of the whole middle part of the song by signaling the journey's over. And we've seen it all. This type of variation is important, but I think I could do little else other than naming more examples. Perhaps a little warning though. Sometimes when the singer is also the songwriter, we get so protective of the melody we created that we don't want to change it. And this goes back to what I was saying before. Are we making music for people to digest all at once, or are we making music to be enjoyed over and over? You don't have to be like Stevie Wonder in Living for the City and go full Ray Charles in the final verse, or like Paul McCartney in Oh Darling, but amping up the soulfulness of your delivery towards the end of a song will almost always be better than repeating it straight throughout. How good can a melody be if it can't build up a little soul, if it can't accommodate some minor alterations? Now, let's talk about contrast in the melody itself. And here I mean not those minor ad-lib changes during the performance, but actual changes that occur during the songwriting process itself. Again, Simon and Garfunkel provide an excellent, neat example of this time in Bridge Over Troubled Water. 3 verses, 3 choruses, and ironically, no bridge. The lyrics follow the usual formula of the verses changing while the lyrics of the chorus remains the same. Yet, you never hear the same chorus. Musically, it's different every time you hear it. And not just in, more strings being added, that's production. Also, on a side note, I should point out that I think it's ambiguous exactly where the chorus actually begins. Does it begin when Art Garfunkel begins singing the title, like a bridge over troubled water? Or does it begin slightly before that, with the lyrics, when pain is all around, which definitely uses the melody of the chorus that immediately follows? If we call this the chorus, then the lyrics do change each time. But then the real lesson here is on the power of ambiguity. Perhaps I will make another video on that topic, but until I do, please see Leonard Bernstein's talk called The Delights and Dangers of Ambiguity, part of his Unanswered Question lecture series, which is easily found on YouTube. Or better yet, watch all 6 lectures. So here is the music for Bridge, and if you don't read music, I think you can still follow along. This is the first chorus. Both lyrically and musically, it divides in half, with the second half being a literal repeat of the first. Exactly same lyrics, exactly same melody. This helps establish the music so that the changes that we find later are more clearly thrown into the foreground. So here is the second chorus, and again, it begins with another literal repeat of what we've heard before. The first change comes in the second half on the word water, which is sung a fourth higher than all the previous times. The melody accompanying I Will Lay Me Down is now also different, and the harmony is different too, telling us that this is definitely a change that occurred in the songwriting process. And here is the third chorus. Note that this time it begins with the previous alteration, with the higher melody of water. In fact, we could go so far as to say that each chorus begins by repeating how the previous chorus ended, each building on or leapfrogging over the previous one. So the one thing we should expect is for this chorus to introduce new melodic elements in its second half. And sure enough, it does. It is much higher, as is appropriate for the climax, hitting a high A flat, and not even ending on the tonic note. The previous chorus didn't either. And yet it ends exactly the way it must end. Now, how much of these changes come from Paul Simon the writer or Art Garfunkel the singer, I don't know, but that only shows us how great they were together. One of the dangers of digital audio workstations is that it's too easy to copy and paste. In the days when everything was committed to tape, when they actually had to copy the tape or literally cut it and then literally tape it together, you can bet it was absolutely necessary to do so. Now, we can do all that with a few mouse clicks. Sure, sometimes we add more vocals or a guitar wailing in the background to make it sound different, and I won't deny that I've done that myself. I certainly have. But the real lesson here in Bridge Over Troubled Water is a reminder that we are writers, we are creators, and as such, we can change the music at a more fundamental level. Too often, even when we don't copy and paste, it sounds as if we just as well could have. Go back to Queen. Look at the Prophet song from their fourth album. There's a certain phrase with a high note. Listen to the Mad Max, listen to a high A. That phrase is repeated several times throughout the song, but every time we hear it, they change the chord. Once it's a B flat major 7. Another time it's an A suspended 4. Again, it's an F sharp minor. I don't want to say that the DAW has ruined music by making copying and pasting so easy. Believe me, when I was a student writing music on staff paper, we had the same temptation. But instead of Control C, Control V, it was the dreaded repeat signs. And we were practically forbidden from using them. Rousseau used to say, if you want to hear it again, fine, write it out again. At least you'll be tempted to make some changes. And that's a philosophy I think I really absorbed. And I should point out that, ironically, Queen, who were so big on contrast and avoiding literal repeats, also provide us with a very neat counterexample in We Will Rock You. I would say that the simplicity of that song is the whole point of the song, and I bring it up because if I don't, I'm sure somebody in the comments will. But I think that's more of an exception, at least to their music, than it is a rule. I started this talk way back when with the question, how much variation is too much or too little? Perhaps the question should be, what kind of variation are we using? Does it add to the overall song? Does it distract? Does it make the listener feel there are more layers than they are getting on the first listen? Stravinsky once said, contrast produces an immediate effect. Similarity satisfies us only in the long run. The coexistence of both is constantly necessary. A song consisting of a basic verse and chorus structure with or without a middle 8 is a pattern. Patterns are what we get when we strip away the variation. In other words, variation was always part of the equation. We see that in the Beatles, in Queen, in Simon and Garfunkel, and others. But patterns, those things that remain when variation is removed, are what get taught in the classroom, in the textbooks, on YouTube tutorials. And these take on a rule-like life. Start with the verse, change the lyrics but not the melody. Go into the chorus, changing neither the lyrics nor the melody. Leave it to the production to add to make each chorus sound a little bit different. And yet, the vast literature of pop music offers plenty of examples showing us that variation can come at any time in the process of song creation. Placing the entire burden of interest on the production does our songs a great disservice. And that's probably only more true in these days when so much music is self-produced, when we don't surrender what we've written to someone else to run with. I'll end with one final thought, one I believe in very firmly. You are only as good a composer as you are a listener. So let's get out there and listen. Listen to the music you love for how the artists use contrast. Listen to music you don't like, or at least don't listen to. There is as much to learn as there is to hear.
Hands dead center.
An interesting question to ask ourselves is how are verses and choruses different from each other? Now we may know it intuitively, but one of the dangers of digital audio workstations is that it's too easy to copy and paste. In the days